Hi friends, this is your pal Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons and Apple's and Ben Stiller's fantastic Severance. And we're going to ask the question, is it possible to use Severance to access our paper selves? All right, let's get into this. Okay, so it turns out I believe Severance was specifically a piece of art that was specifically designed to explore American labor, right? Specifically American knowledge worker labor, and and actually American labor. I think that's a better way to put it. Uh, so, and because of that, I find that it's turning out to be a key to process Dungeons and Dragons. And the reason why is Dungeons and Dragons is outrageously complicated at a level that is pretty much unprecedented in the history of humanity. I actually believe that Dungeons and Dragons is one of the most. It's essentially a new discipline. I think that's a good way to say it. So Dungeons and Dragons is really best understood as a new discipline, a new body of knowledge, right? And like physics or like body of knowledge. Physics is good. What's another one? I'm going to stick with physics right now, right? It's a distinct body of knowledge, and there's a huge amount of complexity behind it. And frankly, in order to even discuss it, you need to have a basic level of expertise, and you have to have a lot of specific language, right? To even discuss Dungeons and Dragons, right? But a lot of what Dungeons and Dragons is about the heart of Dungeons and Dragons. I used to think it was narrative, right? And no question, narrative is really central to Dungeons and Dragons. It's extremely important. But the heart of Dungeons and Dragons is identity, right? And and um and Severance is going right at identity, and it talks about the innies and the outies, right? And they're severed, right? So two identities, one person, right? And what's interesting is and this is why Severance is becoming a key for to understand Dungeons and Dragons, because yeah, let's get there, right? That's what a Dungeons and Dragons player is. Dungeons and Dragons players are multi-severed, right? So we have our personal physical selves, okay? And then we have our paper selves. And generally, a skilled, dedicated dungeon master is going to have between 3 and 30 paper selves, right? And each one of those is a distinct identity with its own sets of emotions, sensations, and memories, right? So one of the things that we're now doing is we in the first 50 years we were simply doing it, right? We weren't really analyzing what we were doing. We weren't thinking even remotely deeply about the ramifications of that, right? We weren't really giving a ton of thought about what it meant to have these paper selves, right? But now we're in the second 50, and it's time to start to look at this, right? So one of the things that I'm really interested in is, so we have our physical self and we have our paper selves, right? And and we pour back and forth, right, into the, and so essentially the best way to think of each of these identities, or a good way, I think we're still figuring out the best way, is to think about each self as a vessel, right? And we pour ourselves into our player characters, and then we can pour back, right? We can pour back into our own vessel, our physical self, some of that paper self, right? But what I'm really curious of is what if we want to access the paper self completely outside of the table, right? Exactly like the severing, right? So basically, a severed employee is saying, okay, I want a clean slate. I only want to deal with my innie self. I want the professional identity to perform, right? And I don't want them to be interrupted by distractions of the personal self, right? The outer world, right? The home self, right? The entertainment self, the entertained self, the home self, the chore self, right? I just want the professional self to be focused, right? Well, same thing. So okay, let's break down where I'm heading here, right? Okay, Scott Garibay, you're looking at him. That's my physical self. Let's talk about my paper self. This is Beryl the Turtle Wizard. He is from the Forgotten Realms, and he has watched the sunrise in both Neverwinter and in Waterdeep. He has eaten breakfast at the Stonehill Inn in Phandalin. He's thrown a coin into the altar of luck. At the shrine of luck, right? And so he is distinct from Scott Garibay. He thinks in a different way. He has more courage. He also has more charisma, right? And he's a little more detail oriented, right? And he's much calmer and gentler than Scott Garibay, right? So okay, so I use him at the table on Sunday night. But what about Tuesday night? What about Tuesday night when I have a friend that I want to interact with, and I know that friend has been having a rough time lately, right? So I think, myself, Scott Garibay, I really am not a sentimental person, and I have difficulty with empathy, right? So, like, if I'm going to, and my friend, I want to get together with my friend. My friend is like, oh, I'm going through this personal struggle. And I'm like, I'd rather talk about, Mufasa 2, Mufasa, the new live action. I don't really want to talk about their problems, right? But Beryl the Turtle Wizard is very patient, right? He's got more kindness, more empathy, more tolerance than Scott Garibay. Can I sever myself and put Beryl the Turtle Wizard there to deal with this, right? Now, I think the answer immediately by most people is going to be no. You can't do that, right? Like, that was done with specific training and specific procedures in the Severance show, right? There was a lot of processing around that. I could do processing. I could do training, right? Like, so I can learn to do this. I think the answer might be no, but is that going to be the case a week from now, right? If I attempt this, if I try it, can I sever my physical self and just present the paper self? Because the paper self, Beryl the Turtle Wizard, is better equipped to manage this conversation than Scott Garibay, right? Now, you're like, wait a second, that sounds really difficult. I totally agree. This is going to be difficult, right? But how would we get there? Well, we'd have to practice. How would we practice, right? Well, the way we would practice this is you would have to practice it with somebody who was also multi-severed, right? Another Dungeons & Dragons player character. So one way we could do this is we could have a physical Dungeons & Dragons player remain anchored in their physical self, and then allow me to speak as Beryl Turtle Wizard, right? And say, okay, is he using language from Faerun, right? Is that going to frighten people, right? Is there ways to, is one area of Faerun more amenable to the modern world than another, right? And so there might be ways to, and even at that, like, we might be able to deliver Beryl the Turtle Wizard with modern language, right? And the reason why is Beryl the Turtle Wizard, he's a wizard, so he could scry. He might even be able to learn modern language and never leave the Forgotten Realms, right? Because he could scry on this world, right? Wait a second, Scott. Forgotten Realms can't scry on the modern actual world. Sure it can, absolutely. It's already been established. It's written into Dungeons & Dragons canon. Did you guys even see the Magic the Gathering cards that clearly showed that the magic realms can actually access our FLGSs, right? Like, they're like, our IRL world is written into Dungeons and Dragons many, many ways, right? So the ability for a Forgotten Realms wizard to scry on our IRL world is fully established within the Dungeons and Dragons canon. Not only is it established in the 1983 Saturday morning cartoon, where people from this world were literally captured and put into Dungeons and Dragons, right? Bobby and Sheila, Hank and Eric, and Presto and Diana, right? All of them were from our IRL world, were Dungeons and Dragons players that were captured into the realms of Dungeons and Dragons. And then Magic the Gathering doubled down on that and literally showed Magic the Gathering characters accessing FLGSs in our real world, right? So that's already been established. So right there, my Barrel of Turtle Witter would need to have been acclimated to modern language, which could be done through scrying, right? So then at that point, we could do this by practice and see it. And we would need to do this by practice because it might be a little dangerous. It might be dangerous intellectually, emotionally, and even spiritually, right? So it's dangerous to go alone, right? So we would need to do this as we would need to aid each other as Dungeons and Dragons Dragon Masters, right? As dedicated players interested in severing and using severed paper selves in place of our physical selves when there are real world situations that our paper selves would serve better than our physical selves. I think this is definitely worth pursuing. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. The important part is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.